What follows is a story rarely mentioned in school history books. Have you ever stopped to think about how Viking warriors managed to craft such fearsome blades using nothing more than the materials around them? Their methods remain astonishing even today. Across the rugged Scandinavian landscape, where daily life demanded toughness, the Norse people produced weapons that would become legendary. Lacking deep mines or advanced furnaces, they relied on an unlikely source of metal, the murky floors of wetlands and slow-moving streams. Northern smiths learned how to turn plain, mud-coated chunks of underwater sediment into blades admired for both durability and elegance. The transformation balanced experience, intuition, and what many at the time believed could only be sorcery. Mastery of fire, earth, and timing was essential. This is the tale of how lethal steel emerged from bog-soaked earth, how patience and knowledge reshaped raw nature. Swamp-formed iron brought both opportunities and challenges. What made it so valuable? What hidden element gave Viking blades their mix of strength and flexibility? Surprisingly, many of the era's most respected swords weren't carved from mountain ore at all. They were born from iron that slowly accumulated in swamps and lakes. Over centuries, tiny organisms concentrated dissolved iron into solid clusters on the bottoms of wetlands. These knobby, rust-colored masses were the Vikings' treasure. Unlike hard rock ore that required mining, this bog iron could be collected in shallow water with poles and rakes. For generations, elders taught the young. Where the water glints, the iron waits. It was a renewable material too. New deposits formed in only a few decades. But gathering it was cold, filthy, back-breaking labor. Workers stood waist-deep in icy water, probing the soft ground for lumpy pieces that resembled sponges packed with mud and roots. At first glance, the material looked worthless, fragile, dirty, and low in pure metal. But it held one powerful advantage. Bog iron carried naturally high levels of phosphorus, which, when handled correctly, strengthened the final metal. Early smiths learned this through long experimentation. Transforming this humble material into a deadly blade required skill passed down orally across generations. Every step, from harvesting to forging, demanded discipline, teamwork, and respect for the forces involved. After collection, the ore was heaped onshore to dry for months. Only once moisture evaporated could the real work begin. For Viking craftsmen, the line between technique and ritual was thin. To them, shaping metal from raw stones was nearly sacred, a dialogue with fire and earth. Before we continue, what's your impression of using swamp ore for weapons? Would you have expected such humble material to create legendary steel? Once the bog ore had dried, it was still far from ready. Packed with clay, roots, and organic debris, the raw material needed purification before it could face the furnace. The Vikings relied on a crucial step known as roasting. They built large fires directly on the ground. When the flames were strong, they layered the dried ore on top, then added more wood, repeating the pattern until a towering stack formed. This layered mound burned for hours. Heat incinerated organic matter, drove off lingering moisture, and made the ore brittle enough to break easily. As the fire consumed the layers, the ore changed from dull brown to deep red or nearly black. When the ashes cooled, the roasted pieces could be smashed into nut-sized fragments with simple hammers. Uniform chunks were vital. If the ore pieces were too large or uneven, the gases inside the smelting furnace could not circulate properly, and the metal would come out impure or not form at all. Skipping roasting meant almost certain failure. It was smoky, uncomfortable labor, but it was the foundation of everything that followed. Preparing ore also devoured resources. Scandinavian forests supplied nearly endless wood, but chopping and transporting it required coordinated effort across the community. Only after crushing was the material prepared for the most decisive moment. Smelting. Viking smelting furnaces, though primitive by modern standards, were ingenious products of centuries of experimentation. A furnace was positioned carefully, usually near water and shielded from winds. The structure looked simple: a vertical, clay-lined shaft reinforced with stone to withstand intense heat. But its proportions and design were refined through generations of trial and error. Choose the wrong clay or shape, and the furnace would crack under fire. Shape it correctly, and it became the beating heart of Viking metallurgy. Before smelting could begin, the furnace had to be preheated for hours to dry its walls and bring them to working temperature. Only then could ore and charcoal be added. The draft, created by its shape, pulled the flames downward into a roaring vortex of heat. This was just the beginning of a long transformation from wetland stone to glowing metal. The next step reveals a fascinating truth. When the Vikings smelted iron, they didn't pour molten metal from their furnaces the way modern steelworks do. Their technology worked differently, and the results were extraordinary. After preheating the furnace, the smiths began feeding it with alternating layers of charcoal and roasted crushed ore. Large leather bellows, operated by 1 or 2 workers, pumped air into the side of the furnace non-stop. This relentless airflow allowed the fire to climb to temperatures around 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to free iron from its ores, but not hot enough to liquefy it. Inside the furnace, the rocky impurities melted and drained away as glowing slag, oozing from a small opening at the base. The iron itself, however, didn't become a liquid. Instead, it formed countless tiny particles that fused into a single glowing, spongy mass. This semi-solid lump, saturated with slag and impurities, was known as a bloom. Smelting could last many hours, or even a full day. The workers operating the bellows needed enormous stamina, pumping rhythmically for hours, feeling the heat blast against their faces as sparks drifted out of the furnace mouth. If they paused too long, the temperature dropped, and the entire process could fail. When the master judged the smelting complete, the front of the furnace was broken open. From within its blazing interior, the smiths pulled the bloom, several kilograms of fiery, misshapen iron that glowed like a sunlit ember. It was the most dramatic moment of the entire operation. Sparks showered the workshop as the lump hit the anvil. This crude piece of iron was far from ready to become a weapon. Now came one of the most physically demanding phases: primary forging. While the bloom was still blazing hot, smiths began striking it with massive hammers, forcing out slag and compressing the iron into a solid bar. Each blow sent eruptions of bright sparks flying, liquid impurities being forced out like water squeezed from a sponge. The bloom needed to be reheated again and again, hammered from every angle, gradually becoming denser and more uniform. This first forging could take hours. By the end, up to half the bloom's original weight might be lost to expelled slag. What remained was a solid yet still imperfect metal bar, raw material that could now be shaped into the foundation of a blade. But it still wasn't steel. To transform it into a weapon capable of holding a lethal edge, the Vikings needed to add carbon, and they had only one method to do it. To turn soft, bendable iron into true steel, Viking smiths had to enrich it with carbon. Without modern furnaces or controlled chemistry, they relied on a slow and challenging method known as carburization. The raw iron bar was heated repeatedly in the hottest part of the forge, buried beneath a bed of glowing charcoal. At high temperatures, carbon from the fuel slowly migrated into the surface of the iron. But this alone wasn't enough to produce steel of consistent quality. To distribute the absorbed carbon evenly, the smiths relied on a labor-intensive ritual of folding and welding the metal. The process went like this. The bar was heated until it turned bright yellow-white. The wana was hammered into a long, thin strip. That strip was folded back onto itself. The twitch two layers were welded together using heat and hammering. Then the whole piece was drawn out again and folded once more. A single blacksmith might repeat this cycle dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. Each fold doubled the number of layers, spreading carbon through the metal and driving out remaining impurities. Over countless repetitions, the iron gradually transformed into steel, gaining both hardness and resilience. Masters judged temperature not by instruments, but by instinct. The shade of the glowing metal, the sound it made under the hammer, even the way sparks scattered from the surface. This intuitive knowledge was earned over years of experience. But the Vikings didn't use one uniform metal for their blades. They understood that a good weapon needed both flexibility and hardness, so they crafted sections of metal with different carbon contents. Low-carbon iron formed the core of the blade, giving it spring and shock absorption. High-carbon steel, crafted through long carburization, formed the cutting edges where sharpness and durability mattered most. This combination produced weapons that could bend slightly under force without breaking, while still holding an effective edge in battle. From these refined pieces, the smiths then built something even more sophisticated, an innovation that would become the hallmark of elite Viking swords. Now we reach one of the most impressive secrets of Viking craftsmanship: pattern welding, the technique behind the most admired blades of the early medieval world. The finest Viking swords, including the famous Ulfbert lineage, were not carved from a single metal bar. Instead, they were crafted from multiple strips of iron and steel with different properties, meticulously combined to create a blade that was both strong and flexible. The process began with selecting several long rods of metal, some softer, some harder, each with carefully controlled carbon content. These rods were heated until they approached welding temperature and then hammered together until they fused into a single bar. But this was only the start. The smith heated this fused bar again and twisted it along its length like a rope. The direction and number of twists shaped the final pattern hidden inside the metal. After twisting, the bar was flattened and sometimes paired with one or more twisted bars to create even richer designs. These multiple pieces were welded side by side, forming the inner core of the blade. This patterned core acted like a spine. Fizzle-softer layers added flexibility, helping the sword absorb impacts without snapping. Harder layers maintained rigidity and structure. To complete the weapon, the smith welded sharp, high-carbon steel edges onto both sides of this patterned center. Achieving a perfect bond between the edge steel and the twisted core required astonishing precision. A moment's distraction could ruin days of labor. Once the forging was done and the blade reached its final shape, the surface was polished and then treated with mild acids. The acid reacted differently with metals of varying carbon content, revealing swirling lines, waves, and braided motifs on the blade. This wasn't just decoration. It was proof of the intricate internal structure and the maker's extraordinary skill. A sword made in this way was a piece of art as much as a weapon, instantly recognizable and highly valued. Only the most experienced craftsmen could perform pattern welding, and their blades became symbols of status, heritage, and masterful engineering. But creating the metal for these swords required something else, something that shaped the environment of Scandinavia itself, an enormous supply of charcoal. Crafting even a single blade demanded an astonishing amount of fuel. Behind every Viking sword, every axe, every spearhead, was a resource so essential and so consumed that it reshaped entire landscapes: charcoal. To a modern eye, charcoal is a simple material, but to a Viking blacksmith, it was nothing less than power itself. Charcoal burned far hotter and cleaner than raw wood, reaching the temperatures needed to smelt iron ore, weld metal, and harden steel. Without it, the legendary weapons of the Norse world simply could not exist. But producing charcoal was a colossal undertaking: the charcoal process. Viking charcoal makers harvested vast amounts of timber, stacking the wood in enormous mounds, sometimes taller than a man and wide as a small hut. They sealed these stacks with turf and earth, leaving only small air vents. The wood was then ignited and allowed to burn slowly under limited oxygen. This process could take days. Inside the mound, moisture evaporated, resins burned away, and the wood transformed chemically into charcoal. The workers needed constant vigilance. Too much air, and the mound would flare up, turning everything to ash. Too little, and the fire would die, wasting the entire batch. An environmental footprint. Producing enough charcoal to support a thriving iron industry required staggering amounts of wood. Over the centuries, this contributed to noticeable deforestation in parts of Scandinavia. Archaeologists still uncover ancient charcoal pits across Norway and Sweden, silent scars documenting how intensely the forests were harvested to fuel the forges. Yet this immense resource expenditure powered a revolution. Its strength enabled the smelting of bog iron. Edmund fed the bloomery furnaces. It split smiths forge, weld. Oyobi Git made the patterned cores and razor edges of Viking swords possible. The legacy of the Viking smelter. When we imagine Vikings, we picture sails, raids, and warriors. But behind every warrior stood a smith, and behind every smith, a charcoal burner, quietly maintaining the fires that made everything else possible. From peat bogs to furnaces, from twisted bars to gleaming blades, the Viking smelter's craft represents one of the most sophisticated technological traditions of the early medieval world.